A man convicted for starting a feud with a neighbor was vying for a pardon. It was reported to him that the opposing clan was spreading false rumors about him. And so he wrote a brief missive to the governor. Dear Governor, if you've heard what I've heard you've heard a lie. Sorry, this is how I talk after I spend a week in Texas, okay? I have to flush it out of my system. You understand, right, Shirley? You know how it is. Now, I confess that I am a fan of hearsay. And if anyone claims that their ears do not perk up when they hear some juicy or salacious news about someone, then you're just lying. Now, to be clear, I prefer for those things that I hear to be true, but if someone shares something with me that sounds halfway interesting, I'm all ears. Let me know. And I think all of us are that way to an extent. We love a good rumor, little idle gossip, maybe just plain old hearsay. We love to hear interesting things about other people. Our ears really wake up when someone begins a sentence with, "They say," although nobody ever says who they are, right? Now, because of the multiple ways that we can communicate with one another these days, hearsay can spread like wildfire. Now, it used to just simply spread across the proverbial backyard fence, and that was good enough. It worked. But then we invented the telephone, and then we got email, and now we have social media. And so nowadays, we have to be super careful because false information, as we all know, can spread very, very quickly. And we think this is a new problem, but it's not. Even Jesus and his contemporaries had to deal with this kind of hearsay and rumor mongering and words spreading like wildfire. Now, they didn't have to worry as much as we do about how rapid it was spread, but it was a day when they had what we call the oral tradition, which meant everything was spread by word of mouth, and it got around very quickly. Word got around. So in the few years that Jesus was walking around the countryside, sharing his wisdom with all the people, he made a few enemies. And of course, they did everything they could to spread false information about him, to smear him. And there seems to have been one specific piece of false information that he had to lay to rest whenever he got a chance. And here's what it was. Apparently, his critics, his enemies, were spreading the rumor that Jesus disagreed with the law of Moses and the teachings of the prophets. This was potentially damning information. To say that Jesus disagreed with the law and the prophets would be a little like today spreading a rumor that a potential presidential candidate doesn't agree with the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights. It's basically what was happening here. So to claim that Jesus wanted to exterminate the law and the teachings of the prophets is not even remotely true. Jesus would not have been called rabbi or teacher if he had been walking from village to village dissing the law and the prophets. People would have rejected him outright. Nevertheless, the rumor was spreading. And when you think about it, it continues to spread even today. Many of us think the same thing. We've been taught that Jesus effectively ripped up the law of Moses, much like an event we saw recently at the State of the Union address, right? Just rip it up. But it's not true. Not at all. Jesus was not critical of the law of Moses per se. In fact, it's the opposite. He was critical of those who misinterpreted it and misused it for their own purposes. And so I hate to burst our Christian bubble, but Jesus doubled down on the law of Moses. And yet the hearsay that he was against the law, the most important, document and writings of his people, it was spreading around because they wanted him to be discredited. And so during his first recorded lengthy sermon, what we affectionately call the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus said, I'm going to set the record straight once and for all. And so he begins, and this is earlier than what I read a moment ago in the sermon. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one letter, not one stroke of a letter will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments, whoever relaxes, as another interpretation says, one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the Pharisees and scribes, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Now, this is Jesus talking. Then I think he's being very clear about his general attitude toward the law of Moses and the prophets. Overall, he's a fan. How could he not be a fan? This is his people's tradition. This is who he is. Now, he certainly tweaks it on occasion, such as challenging what he considers to be a false interpretation of the law that said you can't heal people on the Sabbath. But in no way does he want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. No, he loves the law and the prophets. He loves the tradition of his people. Again, referring to our own sacred document, the Constitution, as an example. I think many Americans would like to maybe edit or amend parts of it, maybe update it here and there, make it a little stronger, but how many Americans want to get rid of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights? Nobody. Now, I think this is probably how Jesus felt about the law of Moses and the writings of the prophets. It was really decades later when the early church felt the need to separate itself from Judaism in order to be a religion that appealed to a wider Gentile audience, that the apostles, not Jesus, but the apostles began to seriously chip away at the law of Moses. And the consequences are now we do not have a law-based religion. It's part of our heritage and part of our tradition, but that's our claim today. We're not a law-based religion, we're a grace-based religion, and that's okay. But this is the history, right? And so for now, in this setting, here's Jesus in his Sermon on the Mount, the great Sermon on the Mount, correcting the rumor that he wants to abolish the law. He doesn't want to get rid of the law. He wants people to go deeper into their understanding and application of the law. He wants his followers to focus on the spirit of the law rather than merely the words of the law. So he decides, like any good preacher in a sermon, to give several examples. One of them is this. You have heard that it was said, you shall not murder, but I say to you, and I'm going to paraphrase him here, but I say to you that you need to get underneath the act of murder and address the root causes of human conflict, such as unaddressed anger and insulting behavior. Seek reconciliation, he's saying, before things get out of hand and you end up in prison because you killed someone in a fit of rage. You see what he's doing here? He's not dismissing the teachings of the law as his critics were falsely claiming. Instead, he's doubling down on them, which means he takes these teachings, their tradition, even more seriously than those who think they are righteous simply because they haven't literally broken any of the 613 commandments in the law of Moses, although Jesus knew they had broken the spirit of the law. Now, knowing that people were using hearsay to discredit him, you know, what they say, right? Whoever they are. I love what Jesus does here. He's really a genius. And I don't know. it's almost humorous what he does. He uses the language of hearsay to launch into a teachable moment. You have heard that it was said, right? It's hearsay. And you have heard that it was said, that is, the it is something from the law of Moses. But I say to you, and then what he does, in each and every example, he communicates the spirit or the gist of some of Moses' commandments to tell them what he's really all about. So the first one again, he says, don't murder. Well, yeah, don't murder. But hey, first try not to get angry or hurl insults at one another, and maybe the murder rate will go down. Don't commit adultery, true. But more importantly than that, be aware of the power of lust that can lead to adultery. Jimmy Carter famously admitted to this in an interview years ago, during a Playboy interview, right? Where he says he equated the lust in his heart with actual adultery, and he was merely being a good Baptist boy like Jimmy Carter was, or is. Give your ex-wife a certificate of divorce? True, do that. But that won't erase the social consequences of being divorced, man or woman, in a time and place when divorce is almost equated with adultery. And by the way, adultery, like murder, was a capital offense, and Jesus knew that, which is why he says, take this a little more seriously. And so maybe a better way to follow the law of Moses is to avoid divorce altogether if you can, if it's feasible. Don't swear falsely? True, don't do that. But if you're a person of integrity and your yes always means yes and your no always means no, then you're less likely to have to swear that you're telling the truth anywhere, in a court of law or anywhere, if people believe what you have to say. Now, those are the examples that we read today, but he gives a couple more I want to share with you because they're important, and really to give the full, understanding of his sermon, this part of the Sermon on the Mount. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but I say to you, do not resist an evildoer. But if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. And if anyone wants to use you and take your coat, give your cloak as well. Now, you only had 2 garments, so you're going to be naked when you do that, but go ahead and do it. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go 2 miles with them, the 2nd mile. Give to everyone who begs from you, and do not refuse anyone who wants to borrow from you. So he's talking largely here about revenge. He's saying don't practice revenge, according to even though the law of Moses said an eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth. But Jesus is saying don't practice revenge. If you really want to be the bigger person, then rather than getting even with the evildoer, give them more than what they took from you. That, if you do that, that will put an end to the vicious eye for an eye cycle once and for all. And then finally Jesus said, you have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor. And somewhere else it says, hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. So love your enemies? Yeah, sure. That's what the law says. But anyone can do that. How about loving your enemies? So do you see what Jesus is doing here? He's taking the literal words of the law of Moses and he's building on top of them. Don't just love your enemies or your neighbors. He says love your enemies. He's not subtracting from the law. He's adding to the law. He's adding more meaning. He's adding more relevance, more wisdom, more love, more spirit to the sacred words of his people. The law of Moses and the teachings of the prophets. And this is our cue. This is ingenious. This is a cue for you and me on what to do, which is take the traditional teachings of the church, take what we've been taught, Old Testament, New Testament, and see if we can find a way to build on that, to go beyond that if we can. We can build on the foundation that has been laid before us and go further and deeper and richer into the kingdom of God. So let's be all ears, Jesus is saying, and hear what the Spirit is saying to us today. Amen.